I'm Jeremy Shepherd.
And I'm Damien.
We use data to expose deceitful property experts and their marketing BS. This is the Expert Busting series.
Welcome to episode 24 of the Expert Busting series. Rent money is not dead money. Jeremy.
Yeah, so it's been said before by many experts that rent money is dead money. The idea has been to own your own home rather than help out a landlord by paying their rent. But that actually doesn't make sense from a financial perspective. It's actually far more likely that mortgage interest money is dead money on your principal place of residence. And we're going to explain why that is. Okay, so the problem with owning your own home is that it's highly unlikely that the place where you want to live, need to live, that's close to work, family, friends and so on, or whatever lifestyle choices you've made, out of the thousands of suburbs around Australia, it's highly unlikely that particular suburb is going to have the best capital growth over the next handful of years. So you are shooting yourself in the foot from a capital growth perspective by owning that home. And if you rentvest, that is rent where you need to live, own where the best place is to invest, then you'll actually be better off financially. And also once that market that you are renting in falls out of favour, like it's if you were owning in that location, would you then sell it if it had reached a peak, flattened out? Because you live there, you're emotionally attached, so you're less likely to sell. But if you are renting there and buying elsewhere, then when the elsewhere market has peaked, you're okay to offload it because you don't live there. It's less of an emotional decision to make.
I think it really comes down to your circumstances, right? Like I always bring it back to your circumstances. What's your strategy? It's not all about just wealth building all the time. There's a point where you go, you know what? I want a bit of my lifestyle. So obviously, I think a lot of people get emotional with it. Like they buy their home or they buy in their backyard or buy an investment where they know the area, or they know where the park is, they know where the shops are, but it's not really optimizing your investment portfolio, is it? So an example might be they might live in the Sutherland Shire, New South Wales, for example, and they buy an investment there because they've grown up there, they've lived there. They think it's just going to keep booming, but there's a higher probability you're going to be getting better capital growth in other markets if you deployed cash again in an investment, for example. So yeah, if you've got $1 million budget, it might be better somewhere else. So it really comes down to, are you in your accumulation phase, or are you sort of at the back end with a family, you want to sort of settle down, you don't want to move around, like having your own home gives you stability.
Okay, so from a overall lifestyle perspective, yes, the rentvesting concept does have its disadvantages. I'm just talking about it purely from a financial perspective. People who are struggling, for example, to get into the property market, to have their own home, I don't think they've got a choice. So I think particularly if you are in Sydney, you're on a low income, how are you going to afford to get into that market? You don't need to. You continue to rent in Sydney where you work, and then you invest somewhere else, like Melbourne, Perth, somewhere cheaper.
Yeah, I think it's about focusing on decreasing your expenses. So like you might be renting somewhere and you might be room sharing, so that brings your rental expense down. You might still have that lifestyle because you're sort of in the inner city, but by freeing up that cash flow, that'll allow you to buy in markets where you can build your wealth really quickly over a 2, 3, 4, 5 year period, and that can, then you can sort of set and forget and let those properties grow. So I think for those first couple, that should be the main focus is, get that accumulation ASAP. So I think you mentioned tax efficiency is obviously the big one because all the expenses for investment properties are tax deductible, and you can talk to your accountant about that, but I'll let you step through the points, Jeremy.
Yeah, so some of the benefits of being an investor owning a property rather than an occupier owning a property, you get to claim the interest that you pay on the mortgage as a tax deduction. That gets deducted from your taxable income. Also repairs and maintenance, insurance and council rates, whereas if it's your principal place of residence, you cannot claim any of those deductions. So these all make owning property as a rental property more tax efficient than owning it as your personal principal place of residence.
I think these are some good points, the hidden costs.
Yeah, so owning an investment property while you're renting is called rentvesting because you're renting while you're investing. I first started rentvesting in 2004. I had, I think, 6 properties back then, and I didn't own my principal place of residence. I was renting, and I realised that it was better to own in a growth market and rent close to work or family and friends or lifestyle decisions. So, yeah, I prefer also living in a unit rather than a house because it's just me. Ease of maintenance, right? Why do I need a big house when it's just me? But houses make better investments because with units you can't control the potential for oversupply. The house next door can be knocked down, a big unit can be built, the one across the road, around the corner. So very hard. But if you buy an investment property that's a house in a built-up area, then the additional supply can't really hurt the house market because you need vacant land. So I was able to rent in a property that's suitable for me and invest in houses which have better, at least long-term growth potential. Also, where I bought during those periods of time, the yield on those houses was actually higher than the yield on the unit that my landlord was getting from me. Yeah, interesting.
Good point. And was it growth when you were rentvesting, like that area that you're renting in, was it growing at a rapid rate or not?
No, so they had inferior capital growth, they had an inferior yield. So it was a good decision for me.
Yeah, so I had a look at the historical charts within our suburb data platform, and I wanted to bring up 2 scenarios. So the first one is like the 5-year period up to January 2020. So just sort of maybe before COVID. I'm not using that as a that time frame, but just that's what we're looking at, January 2020, and then from 2020 to 2025. So 5 years, different time periods, but different outcomes. So the example I wanted to represent here is I remember I had a client that had many properties it was about 3 properties in Perth at the time. And I remember meeting him and he's like, I've read these books and they all said that properties should double in 7 years. But obviously, spoke to him and saying, look, that's why diversification can be really crucial through your accumulation phase. So he was having no capital growth whatsoever. So that 5-year period, I just, I could have gone 7, 10, but I just used 5 for this scenario to make it simple. But Perth went back 6% over that 5-year period. Okay. And then you could have been in like Hobart that had a 64% uplift somewhere. I'm looking at significant urban areas. So I'm sure there's suburbs in there that have, a lot higher than that 64% capital growth. You've got Melbourne had roughly around 49%, Sydney 44%. This is all for houses, by the way. But you can see here, if you're in Perth through that period, you had your own home there, living there, you would have gone backwards, where you could have been invested in these other markets potentially.
Yeah, that Hobart versus Perth comparison for that 5-year period, that's $250,000 opportunity cost owning in Perth.
Now, let's look at the flip side now. So if we go have a look at Perth now, and it was up until 2025, it's one of the best performers just behind Adelaide at 73%. So you would have been laughing. So if you had your owner occupier there, that would have been most probably fantastic because you're getting that capital growth. But if you choose to sell later on too, you're going to avoid potentially any capital gains. Again, talk to your accountant about that because it's your principal place. But this highlights, if you're in Melbourne through that period, you would have had 23% capital growth, but in Perth you had 73%. So this is why it's so important about focusing on specific markets at different times. So again, this is over a 5-year period. And with property investing, it is time-consuming, buying, selling, all the recycling costs. But yeah, this is just to highlight that if you did live in these markets, Perth, Darwin early on, you would have gone backwards where you could have made a lot more money. Even Brisbane only had 19% capital growth to like Hobart, Melbourne and Sydney. Yeah,
I think it's a fantastic example that shows that person who's living in Perth, they could still be living in Perth. It doesn't matter where you live.
Yes.
But if you bought in Hobart, for the first 5-year period, and then you bought in Adelaide for the second 5-year period. It doesn't matter what Perth does, doesn't matter what Sydney does, because you're renting. And you know what else? These are city medians, but within the city you've got some suburbs that will outperform other suburbs. So it's even more pronounced than the numbers we're looking at here.
It's really interesting here because look at the start value. Hobart had the lowest, like the houses, the typical value at that time was around 350. So it was the cheapest out of the lot. So it obviously saw a lot of investor, and I'd say owner-occupier activity, but that really reduced the supply through that period. And if we move forward to 2020 to 2025, actually sort of Darwin's at the lower end from a price point of view, like the starting value. But if we go up to like Adelaide, Perth, like their typical values were a lot lower compared to, for example, Melbourne. So again, I think they would have seen heavy investment activity through those periods. So very interesting. That's the idea. You could be living in a unit or a house somewhere in a market that's having no growth or minimal growth, where you could be invested in these other markets that can change your financial future. So it's a really good, it's just something you need to think about in your wealth building process. And it's just a matter of when's enough. Like there's a point where you're going to go, you know what, I'm happy living in Perth and not moving and having stability. And that's okay as long as you're aware of that.
You know what else I can get out of this? Let's say you're in Perth and the median you can see there is around 565,000. This is for the, that on the left-hand side, the 2020. So obviously not those prices now. But let's say you're priced out of that market, but you could afford a $350,000 property. Well, there you go. And I remember back then the yields in Hobart were some of the best around the country as well. So your cash flow is great. You've got more affordability and you get better capital growth. So, yeah, really good example. All right, so I went through an exercise where I estimated how much rentvesting has paid off for me personally. I looked at the time over which I rented and where I rented, and then I measured the typical capital growth for one of those locations, each of those locations, for the period of time that I was there. And the median growth rate for those areas for those periods was around about 6.5% per annum, which is about the same as the medium long-term national growth rate, which makes perfect sense, roughly what I expected. Then I looked up the top 5 local government areas in the country. So there are local government areas, there are around over 500 LGAs for short around the country. I looked at the top 5 for the start period when I was renting in one of these locations. What are the top 5 local government areas at the same point in time? And the median growth rate for the top 5, this is as scored by the DSR, version 3, was just over 10%. So 3.6% it was better capital growth for each year. Now that's if I randomly selected any property, randomly selected it from a randomly selected suburb in a randomly selected LGA that was in the top 5 by DSR. And I would have been better off by 3.6%. So for the typical property in Australia, that's about $2,000 a month that I'm better off rentvesting. So quite significant. So the suburbs that I chose to rent in and rentvest, it worked out to be a pretty good deal. That was for a period of about 20 years though. And there was nothing special about the locations I was renting in. Like they didn't have terribly inferior growth. It was just national growth rate. It's just that the markets that you can choose to invest in have so much better capital growth. Anyway, so that's what makes rentvesting so beneficial, is that it's the other locations have noticeably better growth. And the difference in growth over the next 5 years between a carefully chosen investment property and the value of the property that I'm renting as a tenant could be literally hundreds of thousands of dollars, like we saw in those examples. Back was it the 5 years ending 2020? So you're looking at prices in Perth and versus Hobart, and the difference is like $250,000. But in today's terms, it's double that. It could be double that. Yeah, so some markets are going to be flat, while other markets are going to be booming. I don't need to live in the booming suburbs. I just need to invest there. But that period of accelerated growth is not going to last forever. So I'll offload that property when the market reaches its peak. But if I was living in that property, I might be tempted, might be biased to come to the conclusion, oh no, it's still got more juice left in the tank. I think I'll ride it a little bit longer. And that could bias my decision from being purely financial to being partly financial, partly lifestyle. So rent vesting has quite a few benefits. But it's not all roses, right? Occasionally as a renter, you will get a notice to vacate and you can't renovate according to your tastes. You can't, pin a picture holder in the wall, not without property manager's permission. So it's not all perfect. And Damo is going to put the shoe on the other foot for a minute to show when owning might make sense.
I think the value add's most probably one. I guess you can do that with an investment too, right? But I guess if it's your own home, you can add a bit of value there. I think the stability and certainty, so you're not forced to move, I think is a big one if you do want that stability. The tax-free capital gains on your principal place of residence. Again, talk to your tax accountant. I know a lot of people that have used that where they buy a property, get the growth, and they don't even look at data. I think people think that they're always going to get that growth, maybe because they've lived in markets that have continuously had growth and they've done a great job doing it. But I do know I've heard of stories where people just keep buying and selling their owner-occupier to make that capital gain. I think the housing cost is a big one, especially leading into the future. You've got no control over rent rises. So let's say you're renting somewhere. That's an after tax expense that you're paying from your income. So you're living in a rental and they just keep increasing the costs quite significantly. Again, you want stability. You set up your place the way that you like. 12 months after, you have to move. Massive headache. It takes time. You got to factor in costs associated with that, the headache. Lower interest rates typically on your owner-occupied debt versus your investment debt. So at time of recording, it might be, let's say your investment debt is 6%. Maybe on your owner-occupier might be 5%. So there could be maybe a 1% difference potentially. So a lower interest rate is one. The other one is I think the only other thing is, what if your owner-occupier does outperform the investment property? That's one thing. So you can look at all the data, but what if you get it wrong? Like there's always that small risk that could potentially happen. But I think if you are buying in markets and you want to build your wealth, you just want to look for any big supply risks. I think that's most probably the big one. So that Perth example was a great one where the DSR3 would have been quite weak back then, which reflected in the low capital growth where you could have been in these other markets and made a lot more money. So look, I think it's just about, do you want flexibility and what's your goal? And if the goal is to build as much wealth as possible, as quick as possible, then I think rent vesting is definitely up there. But later on, when you want that stability, then you might still have those investments that are working for you, but you've still got your castle at home.
Nice.
All right. Conclusion.
Right. Yeah, so rent vesting, rent money is not really dead money. There are some negatives to renting, but if you are looking at making purely financial decisions, not lifestyle decisions, then you are more than likely going to be better off renting where you need to live or want to live and owning in the best growth location around the country that you can afford. And that's probably the only way you're going to be able to get into the property market if you're in places like Sydney and looking to buy like $1 million property there, whereas you could be buying for a lot cheaper somewhere else around the country. And the only way to get ahead is by pursuing those growth locations that outperform the national benchmark.
$1 million isn't going to get you much in Sydney at all.
That number was a bit behind the times, wasn't it?
A bit behind the times. So look, next up in the Expert Busting Series 25, Chasing Yield. Are you chasing the wrong metric? Thanks for watching.